Hello everyone and welcome to EPD Australasia's webinar on the NABERS Embodied Carbon tool and EPDs. Thank you very much for coming along today. I'm Kelly Taylor and I'm the CEO of EPD Australasia. We've got a wonderful team here today. Excuse me. We've got Katie here from NABERS. She is the Embodied Carbon lead at NABERS, and we've got Nicole Sullivan from thinkstep. thinkstep has been involved in the technical development of the tool, so we're really lucky to have both these people here today. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to EPD Australasia and the webinar today, and then I'll hand over to our experts. We do have time for questions and answers at the end of this webinar, so please do use the question and answer function in the Zoom webinar, and we will do our very best to answer those at the end. If we do run out of time, we'll get back to you personally. And many thanks to those people who sent through their questions ahead of time in the registration. We will answer those as well. So, just briefly, as I said, I'm Kelly and I'm the CEO of EPD Australasia. Next slide, thanks. So here we are. So EPD Australasia is an EPD program which is defined by the international standard, the ISO standard 14025. We were set up over 10 years ago by the life cycle associations of Australia and New Zealand, who wanted a system for which they could have verified life cycle assessments for their customers. So that's the Australian Life Cycle Assessment Society of Australia and the Life Cycle Association of New Zealand. They came together and set up EPD Australasia. They identified that the international EPD system was a good platform and partnership for us, and we've maintained that partnership over the last 10 years. So all the EPDs that we publish are also accepted by the international EPD system and are published by ourselves and in the international database. We follow, as I said, the ISO standard, as well as, and mainly what we're talking about today is construction products. We follow the EN standard 15804 for construction products. We also come under the International EPD Harmonisation and Quality Assurance Organisation ECO platform. Now, this organisation is an umbrella platform for EPD programs, and it represents the world's largest EPD programs. So what are we about? We are about quality, consistency and transparency, and we really work towards best practice in everything we do. And that is why we maintain our relationship with EPD International and the ECO platform. In the current environment, we've seen significant increase in interest in EPDs and acceptance of them. They're being recognised in tools such as NABERS and definitely a growing area with its own challenges. So next slide, please. I'll just show you that growth there. So when I say exponential growth, this is what we're seeing. So an explosion of EPDs as they're recognised. And one of the reasons that we've seen this growth is because of recognition of EPDs in rating tools like the Infrastructure Sustainability Council and Green Star. We recently celebrated the publication of our 2000th EPD that was published by Wholesome Australia for one of their concrete mixes. So the future of EPDs. We're seeing an increase in demand for digital EPD data, and I guess, you know, what we'd like to see in the future as EPD Australasia is a seamless integration of EPD data, both by the EPD owners, but also for users of the data that might then take that data into databases, third-party databases or tools for decision making. We'd also like to hope that in the future we'll see much more tools to aid in the EPD development and verification as this becomes a much more fast-paced and growing field. And of course, increased recognition in the value of EPDs. And that leads us to the recognition of EPDs in the NABERS Embodied Carbon tool and the important role that EPDs play in that tool. So I'd like to welcome Katie from NABERS. She is the Embodied Carbon lead. and she's been involved right back from the initial development stages in the NABERS tool, and she's going to lead us through the tool and what it means. Thanks, Katie.
Great, thank you. All right, let's go to the next slide, thanks. And we can skip this one as well because we all know it's NABERS Embodied Carbon. So I'll just start with a little intro to what NABERS is, what we do, because some of you might not be too familiar with us because we're, have just spent the last couple of years in this space. So NABERS measures performance and the way the environmental performance of buildings. And the way we do that is on a 6-star rating scale. Yeah, next slide, thanks. So we measure environmental performance for operational things like operational energy use, water, waste, indoor environment, so things like air quality and noise and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, of course, now embodied carbon as well. And the reason why we do that on a star rating scale is so that we can enable fair comparison. So when we place buildings on a star rating scale based on their performance, we're taking things into account in terms of, what the floor area is, what the function of a building. For embodied carbon, the height of a building, for example, is one of the things that we correct for, to make sure that if you're doing a rating, giving us your data, and then getting a star rating result, you're comparing apples to apples. So for example, if we collect data for a 5-story office building in the Melbourne CBD that's kind of built on a swamp, or a 20-story building, office building in Sydney that's built on sandstone, we're correcting for things and providing a star rating scale that lets you understand how that building is going compared to what we would expect for a building of that size and shape and purpose. Next slide, please. So yeah, we certify buildings on all of these things. Embodied carbon is the most recent addition. Next slide. And we rate a variety of spaces. So all of these we will be rating for embodied carbon apart from data centres. But yeah, we work in a wide variety of buildings. And yeah, next slide, thanks. And you can see we have a lot of rated buildings. So these are just some examples from our website of buildings that are rated around Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth. We have a lot of ratings because we've been around for over 25 years, and office energy ratings, for example, are mandated by the federal government. If you want to sell or lease a space that's over 1,000 square metres, you have to have an operational energy rating in place. So yeah, I have a lot of experience rating buildings. Have been doing it for decades, and have a lot of buildings rated around Australia. Next slide, thanks. What we've learned over time is measurement, of course, leads to improvement. So a couple of examples here. You can see office buildings, for example, once they've been rated for 10 years, they're using about close to 40% less energy than they were at the beginning, and shopping centres have been on a faster trajectory. And when we're looking at this graph, the important thing is this is all buildings. It's not just offices that are, choosing to rate. It's everyone, because the vast majority of offices, if they're over 1,000 square metres, have to be rated at some point, and tend to keep their ratings so that they can sell or lease or do whatever they want to do. So this is all buildings. So yeah, not just the better ones or the ones that are making more of an effort to improve. Next slide, thanks. So when it comes to embodied carbon, we know that there are 3 actions needed from buildings to reach net zero emissions. Reducing energy use and eliminating fossil fuels are already quite well underway, and the other NABERS tools look after that. And then the third thing left there is to tackle embodied carbon. So that's when we started on this work to create an embodied carbon rating tool. Next slide. Yeah, great. So yeah, why focus on embodied carbon? Because in 2021, GBCA and ThinkStep published this paper that showed us that at that time around 16% of emissions in the built environment came from products and materials used in construction and refurbs. But, you know, without any intentional action, they could see that that would likely rise to around 85% of whole of life emissions by 2050. So it's very clear that someone needed to be doing something about putting together a method for measuring embodied carbon in buildings. And that's where NABERS came in. So next slide, thanks. So yeah, we started figuring out what to do about this in 2021. And the way we went about it was pretty much just to speak to everyone involved in the process of building a building, from developers to architects and engineers, policymakers, and then, you know, product manufacturers, of course, as well. We spent a couple of years doing a lot of industry consultation with ThinkStep as well, helping us with that, to figure out, okay, if we want to measure embodied carbon in a building, how do we do that? You know, how much of the building are we measuring? Are we trying to measure everything down to all the nuts and bolts, or do we just look at the main contributors to embodied carbon? You know, try to get 80 or 90% measured. You know, what's most practical? What emission factors should we be using? All these kinds of questions we worked through with industry to figure out how to develop a rating tool. Next slide, thanks. And yeah, through that consultation process with industry, we landed on these kind of overriding objectives from the tool. For the tool, we need to drive action to urgently reduce emissions right away. We need to focus on being able to compare results between, you know, buildings, understand, you know, what's good, what's not so good. Everyone be measuring in a consistent way, and also verify that those measurements are accurate. And the third one there is, yeah, get started by solving well-defined problems right now. Because there's a lot of, especially, you know, 3 or 4 years ago, there's a lot of problems to solve in embodied carbon, quite a few unknowns. But what we can do is start by solving the well-defined things now, and then have a roadmap for the things that we aren't able to solve now. So yeah, really just focused on urgent action there. So yeah, we put that together with a lot of input from industry, and by sort of 2024, mid-2024, we really had national agreement on the tool. You know, it was developed in partnership with the GBCA and industry. It's been fully aligned with international standards for measuring embodied carbon in buildings. We worked closely with Infrastructure New South Wales and Infrastructure Australia as well to make sure we're all taking similar approaches. So no matter what sort of project a team is working on, you know, the theory behind how you measure embodied carbon is the same. It's already in policy in a few places. So the New South Wales Sustainable Building STEP uses the NABERS methodology. There's a federal environmentally sustainable procurement policy for government assets, and then it is also a voluntary pathway in the NCC 2025 update. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of the tool itself, what are we looking at? The tool measures upfront embodied carbon. So everything from raw material supply through to the end of the construction and installation process. Next slide, thanks. So the reason why we focused on upfront embodied carbon is because we just need urgent action on the emissions that are taking place now. And we know that, you know, upfront embodied carbon is the biggest part of the picture. So the report recently published by ASBEC showed us that around 65 to 75% of all embodied carbon in a building is that upfront embodied carbon. Of course, looking at whole of life is important, but for buildings, if we were to look at whole of life carbon now, we would be making assumptions about the future, which may or may not end up happening. So for now, for the NABERS tool, we really wanted to stay focused on the biggest part of the picture, urgently reduce emissions that are happening now, and avoid kind of trading off emissions now for things that may or may not happen in the future. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, so in terms of how we measure, it's pretty kind of simple in a way. Obviously, there's a lot of detail to this, but essentially we're just looking at the quantity of each material, and, you know, then what are the emissions of each of those materials, and then adding on transport emissions, the energy used on the construction site, and emissions from construction waste. Next slide. So if we're talking about what materials we're measuring, what are we actually talking about? We're talking about the main contributors to embodied carbon in the building, so substructure, superstructure, envelope, the bigger internal items, and building services and vertical transport. We haven't included things like fixtures and fittings and other, you know, things that make a smaller impact, because we really need the tool to be practical. So by including what we have included, life cycle analysis of quite a few pilot buildings and, you know, sample buildings earlier on in the process showed us that once we include all this, we're measuring about 90% of the upfront embodied carbon, and these are the materials that are more likely to have measured emissions. There's more data around for them. Once you get into the smaller bits and pieces, you're just, you know, spending a lot more time measuring. There might not be good data for those things. So yeah, landed on looking at about 90% and focusing on the main materials. And yeah, here's an example of what that looks like if we're looking at what materials you have to include for the different building types that can be rated there. So you can see it's pretty consistent across the board, mainly because we want to make it easy for everyone and not have, you know, different things in each building type, but also because when we did life cycle analysis, it was very consistent in terms of different building types, what things make the majority of the impact. There's just a couple of differences you can see there for retail and industrial. For example, internal walls aren't included. That is because for retail and industrial, internal walls can be the tenant fit out. So what we want to do when we're measuring embodied carbon for the build is focus on measuring things that are the responsibility of the developer. Because if we include things that could be the developer or could be the tenant, then it starts to get a little unfair in terms of how much we're measuring and what some projects might have access to versus others in terms of information. So yeah, we're really focused on things that are in control of the developer. Yeah, great. So yeah, in terms of measuring material quantities, what's really important is having as-built data, evidence of what was delivered to site. So Nicole will talk a bit more about this later, but yeah, we're really talking receipts, delivery dockets, purchase orders, returnable schedules, and really important to collect that during the construction process. Next slide. And yeah, so then we know how to measure what materials we're measuring in terms of the emissions. We heard really strong industry preference for process-based product-specific data, which Nicole will, of course, talk more about. So the options are EPD, another approved, independently verified source of process LCA data, so a carbon footprint that's equivalent in system boundary to an EPD or climate active, or if you don't have one of those things, then the NABERS default emission factors. Yeah, so next slide, thank you. So we created NABERS default, a database of NABERS default emission factors because there wasn't another source available in Australia for process-based up-to-date information for the product or for all of the products that we need to have an emission factor for to do a NABERS rating. So we created, yeah, the defaults for everyone to use, which are published publicly and available for everyone to use now. We created those by collecting all of the data that was available to us, so all of the EPDs for products that are available in Australia and all other process-based LCA sources that were appropriate. Defined material groups, so for example, the different strengths of concrete in situ, for example, And then, had workshops with industry groups. So, all of the manufacturers, for example, LCA folks and sustainability consultants, all the people that, might want to input into how we went about this, had industry workshops with them to make sure we'd collected all the data, to make sure that was available, to make sure we had grouped them in appropriate groupings of things that are used in a similar way or manufactured in a similar way, or where the emissions were comparable. And then, if we go to next slide, we can see what that looks like in the actual database. So we have on screen here the concrete in situ groupings, for example. So you can see that for each of those concretes, we have a maximum in category emission factor. That was the maximum that we found in any EPD or other appropriate data source. We have the minimum in category. So if you're looking at this, you can get an idea of what is the lowest emission product, in that grouping that's available in the market at the moment. Then we have the average emission factor, which you might use if you're kind of modeling. If you think that you're designing a building and you think that you're going to be using products that have published emission factors, you might use the average emission factors there to model what end result you might get. But then we have in that blue column there, the very important one, these are the default emission factors that you must use for a NABERS rating if you don't have an EPD or other appropriate evidence. And the defaults are conservative. The way that we created those was to take the maximum category, the maximum emission factor that we found for any product in that category, and then add some additional uncertainty to that. So, for example, you can see the top one, the top concrete product there, that is a tier 3. We've allocated each product category a tier, either 1, 2, 3, or 4, based on the quality of the data that was available to us. So tier 1 means there's a lot of available data. We have good coverage of different companies, different locations, all that kind of stuff. So we're pretty certain of that data. For those ones, there's a 2% increase for uncertainty. Once you get to tier 3, we're a lot less certain. Maybe there's only a couple of measured data points available. So for those, we're adding 10%. And then by the time you get to tier 4, which is the worst data quality, we're adding 15%, I think. Ooh, now I can't remember off the top of my head. It's either 15 or 20. We don't have many tier 4s. But yeah, so the default figure that you would use without an EPD is essentially the worst emission factor that we found out there, plus a little bit of uncertainty adjustment. And we did it that way because if you don't have measured data, we simply don't know what emissions are associated with that product. So we don't want to underestimate. And we know that products that have EPDs are likely to have lower emissions because they're actually, measuring and doing something about it. So yeah, I think next slide, thanks. Last thing I wanted to mention was just we do get the odd question about, well, how do you know that what people are telling you is correct? People could say, oh, I've got this EPD for this concrete product that was used. We check, ratings are audited. So you need that as built evidence if you're saying you've used a specific product and you're giving us an EPD for it instead of using that conservative default emission factor. NABERS audits all ratings, and when we audit, we are especially careful to check the evidence for items that make a bigger difference. So, for example, if you've used a product-specific emission factor, especially for a high-impact material such as a steel or aluminium, we do check that you have given us the delivery dockets, and we check that the EPD is the correct one for that product and that the evidence all lines up. So I will pass over. Ooh. Yeah, I think I'm going back to Kelly here. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Katie. So now I'd like to introduce you to Nicole Sullivan, Impact Director at ThinkStep. Nicole has over 30 years of industry experience, background in manufacturing processes, sustainability, and green building.
Thank you, Kelly. So we're looking at embodied carbon and EPDs today. So we're going to have a look at the NABERS Embodied Carbon rules and how EPDs are included in them, and how that will play through then in terms of NABERS embodied carbon ratings. So we'll go through a quick overview of the rules as they relate now. The NABERS embodied carbon rules describe the role of EPDs and the requirement for on-site use of building products in the rating process. So they're very specific about what is required, about how it works, about what kinds of disclosure of carbon footprints are okay, and therefore what is not. EPDs are one of the preferred means of disclosing product upfront carbon. The acceptable sources for evidence for a product-specific emission factor are stated in the rules. And you can see on this slide and all those following that we do have a copy of the page indicating where on it. And if you have your magnifying glass, you'll see that this is section 9.4.2 that I'm drawing from. So all of this is actually drawn from the NABERS rules, and the NABERS rules are publicly available online. So if you want to use, sorry, go back a sec, Steve. If you want to use a product-specific emission factor, you need to have a third-party verified process LCA, which is how we generate EPDs, but it can also be used as part of a carbon footprint declaration or climate active product certification. And if you don't have something that's product specific like that, we can use industry average emission factor data, but only as the worst case scenario, and we'll cover that shortly. So if you want to use an EPD, it needs to tick all of these boxes. These are documented in the NABERS rules. So for a valid EPD, it needs to be compliant with ISO 14025, which in ISO language makes it a Type 3 environmental declaration, and either EN 15804, which is a European standard for product category rules for construction products, or ISO 21930, which is the international standard equivalent, and it's very similar, and that's generally used in the United States. The EPD does need to be independently verified, or also referred to as third-party verified. It must have a valid registration number and validity date, which are generally found on the front page of the EPD, and they must be published online by an EPD program. If you have an EPD for a specific material, it must have a unique product name or code so that it's identifiable. And if you have an industry average EPD, then there are extra provisions it needs to comply with. And of course, EPD Australasia EPDs tick all of these boxes. Next slide. If you need to use an industry average EPD or an industry sector EPD, the material used in the building that is being rated by NABERS must be from a manufacturer that has contributed data to the industry average EPD. Some industry EPDs will report manufacturers that contributed data and others that contributed financially. The financial contributors can't claim the data in the EPD. When you have an industry sector EPD, the emission factor that is used by NABERS is the worst case emission factor in the EPD. So you take the carbon footprint as declared in the EPD, and every industry average EPD will report a variance on the carbon footprint. And so if it's the maximum result was 10% more than the average, then you would need to claim that 110% of the average number. Next. You can use a carbon footprint, but beware. So to use a carbon footprint, these conditions need to be met and they are not standard. So compliant with ISO 14067 or PAS 2050 is standard for a good carbon footprint on the market. But NABERS has additional requirements, and the reason for these additional requirements is so that the data is comparable. Because we're adding all of these together, we can't add apples and lemons. We need to make sure we're adding apples and apples. So it must be equivalent in system boundary to EN 15804 or ISO 21930. So those same standards that I just mentioned for the EPDs. That means, for example, that it needs to cover the same modular structure, A1 to A5, so it needs to be equivalent in scope to that. It also means things like you can't use mass balance accounting because that's specifically excluded from the boundary of calculations that are done to EN 15804 and ISO 21930. Just like an EPD, it must refer directly to the material, either by unique product name or code. It must be independently verified. Again, this is not standard for a carbon footprint, so watch for that. And it also must be dated within 5 years before the last delivery of the product to site. Next. You can also use data from a climate active public disclosure statement. So just to be clear, you can't claim carbon neutrality of products as part of the calculation of the main NABERS rating, although they do have a carbon removal indicator that it can contribute to. So we can discuss that more if anyone's interested. But what we can do is we can lift the emission factor out of the public disclosure statement or PDS from Climate Active. So if we want to do that, it must be a product certification specific to the material. It must be certified and published by Climate Active. It must be valid with a technical assessment date within 1 year of the last delivery of product to site. And it must refer directly to the material either by unique product name or code. If you don't have an EPD, it will be assigned the high NABERS conservative default value for impacts. So let's just think through that. If you don't have an EPD or a qualifying carbon footprint, etc., it will have the high value that NABERS is assigning. Now, that's okay. That means that any product can be used in a NABERS rating and it can be assigned an emission factor. But if you're a manufacturer or you're sourcing from a supplier and you have an EPD, what that means is that any EPD is likely to have a lower emission factor than the conservative default that NABERS is applying. So it's an enormous incentive if you want to be a preferred supplier or if you want to be able to lower your NABERS embodied carbon rating to seek products that do have EPDs. Next. Katie touched on this, but I really want to reinforce it. If a NABERS embodied carbon rated building wants to be able to claim that it has used a product with an EPD, it must be accompanied by evidence that it was built into the finished building. If you don't have evidence that it was included in the finished building, it simply can't be used. So if a building team comes forward and says, yes, we use this concrete, this steel, this timber, whatever, that has an EPD, they must be able to back that up with suitable evidence, which we'll discuss shortly, to demonstrate that it was actually installed in the building. Even having it just noted somewhere is not enough. You must be able to prove the procurement of that product for that building specifically. So what's the evidence? It must confirm the quantity of the material and identify both the material and the manufacturer. So again, this is all in the NABERS rules and are publicly available to have a look at, but acceptable data sources that can be used to prove which materials were used in the building are invoices, delivery dockets, purchase orders, or returnable schedules. They must include the name, the letterhead or logo of the contractor, and the name of the author of the document, and it must have that date of data entry. It's incredibly important that this is secured through the lifespan of the project. So if I can talk to project teams for a moment, if you are building a building, I know that this isn't a short exercise. It can take not just months, but years, and sometimes several years. You must be collecting this as-built documentation throughout the whole project. I'd suggest on a monthly basis from your contractors and subcontractors and storing it away, because you cannot claim the use of a product with an EPD, which will lower your emission factors, if you don't have that as-built evidence. And we've already seen in pilots that a lot of project teams are not collecting that evidence as a matter of course. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about product-specific EPDs and how they deliver an advantage. So to start with, I want to say EPDs just matter to customers and consumers in general. They show a commitment to transparent environmental data that the government industry associations, suppliers and customers can trust. Oh, my little icons have all disappeared. So the first is green buildings and sustainable infrastructure. So yes, they're important to NABERS Embodied Carbon. They're also important to ratings like Green Star and infrastructure sustainability, for example. When you have an EPD, customers can confidently specify products that have a lower impact. So they can see your impact, and if they have the right knowledge about making sure they compare carefully and making sure that they understand the basis for the comparison, they can actually understand which products have a lower impact. You can use EPDs for benchmarking and improvements. So we're now seeing companies that are up to publishing their third iteration of EPDs. And so their EPDs over time are demonstrating the changes that they are making in their manufacturing process. For example, their manufacturing is becoming more efficient, they're transitioning to the use of more renewables, and that data is coming down in their EPDs. And that is then showing in a very credible and trustworthy manner that they're reducing their impacts. Government regulations in Australia, Katie has already mentioned, and we're seeing also in New Zealand, for the New Zealand audience, that we do have the New Zealand Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, or MBIE. Their previous Building for Climate Change has now been changed to their Climate Change work stream. It does encourage EPD information, and we're hoping that it may also enter the building code at some point. And finally, investors are also starting to ask for EPDs. They want to understand that you have a credible source of data associated with the impact of products or of the building that you're building. EPDs are based on international standards and they are independently verified, as I said, and that's why we know we can trust them. We're holding a really high standard for EPDs, and I recognise many names on the call today. One is my old verifier, Rob, back from when I did an LCA and EPD. I tell you what, those verifiers, they put them through the ringer. But it's a good thing, and it makes the work product better and more trustworthy. As we mentioned, EPDs are registered in a central system and publicly available. So EPD Australasia has them all online on the website that everyone can see. There's no producing something out of a back pocket or a cereal packet. And EPDs must follow common rules for data for the same product, and that's called product category rules. So if we're dealing with product-specific EPDs, what do you need to know? The next slide. What you need to know is that NABERS has conservative default factors for the emission factors that are designed to represent the worst case product on the market in Australia. It is likely that individual products who get an EPD will be able to demonstrate a lower carbon footprint than the default. That gives you a market advantage. Transparency of carbon footprint allows NABERS project teams to achieve and demonstrate lower carbon buildings and get a better rating under NABERS Embodied Carbon. And in the end, we want to do this because a lower carbon built environment helps us to move towards net zero. So EPDs really do play that pivotal role in measuring and in verifying our progress towards net zero for the built environment. And with that, I'll hand back to Kelly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I'd like to crack straight into our question and answer session as we've gone slightly over our time. So I want to make sure we have lots of time for this. I've seen a few questions pop up in the Q&A, which is amazing. Thank you. So I'll just kick off with some of these ones that were sent through with the registration. And thanks a lot to Nicole and Katie. I think you've answered a lot of the questions that have come through already, but perhaps we can elaborate on some of these. So one of the questions was, how will NABERS ensure that the products specified are actually used in the project? And I think that both Katie and Nicole, you covered this off quite well. You're looking at as-built data, so really looking at evidence-based checking of what's used in the project. So Katie, do you want to elaborate on that at all?
No, I think auditing, we take it really seriously because, yeah, like I mentioned, there are some rating types that are mandated by the government. So if it's mandated, it has to be thoroughly checked. It has to follow the rules. So we take auditing really seriously and we do check these things.
Great. That second question, Katie, is all the data in the NABERS Embodied Carbon tool derived from EPDs? I think we've talked about what can be used, and Nicole's elaborated on that in terms of the product carbon footprint and the climate active certification. But maybe this question is more in relation to those default emission factors.
Yeah, so the defaults are based on EPDs for all the products that are available to use in Australia that we could find, but also if we found other sources of information such as climate active or carbon footprints that were appropriate, we also included that. I forgot to mention that we will update the default emission factors every year, by the way. So as new EPDs get published, those numbers will change accordingly.
Great. Thank you. And I think that answers question 4 there, which I was going to lead on to around the updating of it. So that's really good to hear. So annual updates to those default emission factors. Thank you. Question 3, does NABERS only accept Australasian EPDs? Again, I think we've answered that one. It's not, they don't have to be EPD, Australasia EPDs, but they have to meet those standards, which we know are really important, EN 15804 or ISO 21930. This one perhaps for you, Nicole. If a company has an existing product carbon footprint on their website, can I use it?
Maybe. It depends. So in my presentation, I went through the list of criteria that NABERS has in their rules. So please refer to the rules for NABERS and refer to the information behind the number that you see on the carbon footprint on the website. So it needs to be aligned with those standards. For example, it needs to be independently verified and so forth. There are some carbon footprints that are published that even may be endorsed by certain organisations that do not comply. So, for example, there's some that are published using a mass balance methodology to claim a lower carbon footprint product, and those are not acceptable under these standards because it doesn't comply with the rules.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nicole. I think that's something that we all need to be really aware of is, what is quality data and what is not. And NABERS has really, through their rules, defined that. Great. There's a couple of questions that have come through. Thank you so much to those people that have plugged them in there. There's a couple around what's included and what's not that you might be able to answer for us, Katie. Rod Vockler has asked, would surface coatings be included or not? Assuming not.
Yeah, no, they aren't. Based on the LCA analysis that we did, anything that was less than 1%, we didn't include. We did get some feedback during the training. Someone raised this as well and said they thought it might have a bigger impact. So yeah, if you happen to think it does have a bigger impact and you have some evidence or info you could send us, that's great. We're always keen to hear.
And then there's another one around inclusion. It says, what is the reason why temporary formwork is not considered in the NABERS calculation? Just thinking this could negatively impact steel-framed composite buildings utilising Condeck, permanent formwork, but have a large reduction in temporary formwork used.
We didn't include temporary formwork because the calculations are just quite complicated and difficult to know whether they're accurate. So, for example, knowing how many times it would be reused, knowing, it's just a bit complicated to calculate or make assumptions about, and also generally speaking, the impact is not big enough to worry about in terms of the overall building. But yeah, again, if you have some concerns, definitely send it through and we'll look into it.
Thanks, Katie. There's a really great question here from CJ Wilson. How will the star rating adjust over time as the industry decarbonises?
Typically for NABERS, it doesn't, especially for operational ratings like an operational energy rating, because a company wants to track their trajectory over time to see how they're improving their rating. For embodied carbon, we don't have any immediate plans to change the algorithm. It was developed using the average default emission factor that we looked at, so the average of what's on the market at the moment. So to get a 3-star rating at the moment, which is market average, is actually quite a challenge, because you'd have to be using EPDs for the majority of your big impacting products, which, you know, at the moment isn't really happening that we've heard of. So yeah, to get 6-star, you'd have to reduce your emissions by 80% compared to an average building at the moment. So it is quite a challenging scale, which means it shouldn't have to change over time, but we'll see what happens. And likewise, if it turns out the scale is too harsh, we will also adjust for that. But yeah, we expect it. We think it's fine at the moment, but we'll keep an eye on it.
And wouldn't it be great to think at some stage we'll have the problem that all the buildings will be 6 stars?
Yeah.
I've had a couple of people in the question answer just ask around explain how you might add those A4 to A5 modules in an EPD that only covers A1 to A3.
So in terms of the rating tool itself, for A4 and A5, we have defaults that can be used, which are based on, you know, industry consultation, information from various industry bodies, published data from studies that are trusted, like Carbon Leadership Forum and whatnot, or CSIRO. But if you have your own data, you can replace it with your own data. And so we have published all that. If you download the calculator, you can look at what the sources are for A4 and A5 and see how we've done that if you'd like to look into it.
Great, thanks, Katie. A couple of people have asked about how they can actually access the calculator. So how would they do that?
Yeah, if you just Google NABERS Embodied Carbon, it should go to the main page that has that on it.
And the links in the chat.
Oh, great, thanks.
Great. We've got a question here from Katrina. I'm hoping that you can read that as well. Maybe, Nicole, you could have a look at this one. So with the concrete example, she's just asked about different declared units and how that might be an advantage or a disadvantage.
Yeah, so it's tricky because you can have different declared units, and the example that we've been given here is concrete with a declared unit of cubic meters rather than kilograms, I think it was. So the NABERS calculator makes everything equal. So the thing that project teams must do is actually convert into what the NABERS calculator requires. I think for concrete it's cubic meters, but I could be wrong. But there are densities available, but also the EPDs should be providing you those critical conversion factors. And so when project teams are selecting one concrete or another, they should actually be putting the data into the calculator, and then they'll be able to compare apples for apples like that. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Katie?
Yeah, just for concrete, also by mass is fine.
Great.
You'll see the emissions come up.
Yeah. Excellent. Right. Gosh, we've got quite a few more questions coming up, which is wonderful. I'm just going to take this one from Kurt Nolan. So can the NABERS figures be used as the benchmark that the product EPD figures can be compared with to calculate upfront reductions from?
I'd suggest not. I think the NABERS default factors that have been calculated are you know, our best estimate of where we think the maximum is likely to sit in the market, but we have added an uncertainty factor, and as Katie said, we don't know what the whole range of data is, so we don't know that that's absolutely the maximum, or maybe we've overestimated the maximum. We just don't know. So you can certainly calculate that your product is a certain amount less than the NABERS default value, and you need to be very careful of greenwash, but you could explain that it's so many % less than the default value that NABERS will has published. But to claim a level of environmental superiority on that basis, I think would be dangerous. If you wanted to compare to a more solid benchmark, I'd suggest the NABERS average that they've published is like if your product is less than the NABERS average, I think that's a reasonable claim to make. Because that's, you know, it's halfway between all of the existing published EPDs. But it is something to be very, very careful of, because we, again, until every product in the world has an EPD, we don't know what the true range is.
Yeah, that's right. It's only an average of what we know so far.
Absolutely.
And somewhat in line with that, there's another question here. Does the GBCA accept the NABERS tool as evidence of upfront embodied carbon reductions?
They are planning to. So they published a consultation paper a few months ago where they noted that that was their plan and asked for feedback. And so they're going through the feedback at the moment. But if you want to see what they proposed, you can take a look at that paper. Essentially, it's accepting the NABERS methodology and using that, and also the NABERS emission factors too.
GBCA have been involved all the way through in the development of the NABERS methodology. NABERS has worked, you know, closely hand in hand with them. And so I'd expect that that will come through.
Yeah. Got a couple of questions around biogenic carbon, if that's included.
So we don't take that into account in the actual star rating or what your results are per metre squared, but we have a separate carbon removal indicator where we show stored biogenic carbon and also a climate active. If you have a carbon neutral climate active product, we'll show that as well. Yeah.
Right.
There are specific rules around calculation of emission factors for products with biogenic carbon, and I'm not going to go into detail right now unless someone's really keen, but there are very specific rules around the calculation of stored biogenic carbon and how the carbon footprints are reported through from EPDs for products with that.
Yeah. Thanks, Nicole. Katie, one of the questions is, what does the NABERS Embodied Carbon Calculator look like, and how does it interface with a BIM?
How does it interface with what, sorry?
BIM.
Oh, right. So it is a calculator in Excel. If you are using BIM, I think, yeah, it doesn't. We don't have a direct interface at the moment, but we've been working with a few different companies that are that help people measure embodied carbon as they go through their construction process to see how we can align things. So, for example, if they can align their data with the product categories that we use for the default emission factors, and they use the default emission factors, it shouldn't be too hard to kind of line things up and be able to estimate a NABERS result.
Great. Thank you. We're going to have to wrap up as we're running out of time, but thanks everyone for those really good questions. There are a few that perhaps we haven't got around to answering, so we'll endeavour to do that personally afterwards. We are recording the session and it will be available on our website, hopefully in the next day or two. If you do have an unanswered question or any further questions, please feel free to get in touch with me. And just a final thank you to Nicole and Katie for your time and your knowledge today. It's very much appreciated. Hopefully we'll get you back sometime to talk more about this, as I think it will become a real topic of interest in the future. Please.
Sorry, can I just interrupt for just a second? Somebody was asking about the calculator. If you click on the estimate your rating button, it'll take you through to a calculator.
Excellent. Thanks, Nicole. We might be able to pop a link to that on our webinar page when we pop the recording up as well for people. If anyone has any suggestions for future webinar topics also, please get in touch with us. And thank you all for coming today.
Thank you.